So we looked at that frequency regulation based on just load changes, right? Loads going up or down, air conditioning coming on, people going to factories, closing and the shifts ending. Now what you're going to start doing with frequency regulation is adding variability not just to the load, but now to the generation, which is, hey, renewable energy is extremely important. It's something I want for my family. It'd be like if I had a line of 10 generators and they all ran perfectly. They all took fuel except for the last one. And that one, the fuel was for free, but this thing went up and down and just kind of caused trouble. I'd probably still run it and work around it because of the fuel savings. So that's what you see here. This is a picture of Tehachapi from California ISO over a month, and what the variability is of the wind power out of that region for that period of time. Very unpredictable, very difficult to deal with, and a challenge for what we're going to be working with in California. PV is not any different. Matter of fact, a lot of experts say it's actually more difficult because there's no inertia behind PV. You don't have any rotating mass. It's going to change more dramatically, more rapidly. Just another PV because I thought these were kind of neat to look at. So. And then when you kind of put everything together and you start having to think about, how do you operate the grid? Once again, you have to operate the grid. It just doesn't happen on its own. And suddenly you're having these kind of swings. It's going to become far more drastic to deal with. And you're going to have to either buy a lot more regulation, or you're going to have to find a better, faster, more precise way of regulating around the market. And thankfully, there's actually a way to do that that's very cost effective and starting to be implemented now. So you got some people, well, let's just quickly, just a little bit more. I kind of made the point on the need for more regulation. California right now, 2007, about 380 megawatts, 1% of the load once again. And then, with the increased variability up to 630 megawatts, and this is getting to the 20% target that we had before. Of course, we're talking 33% at this point. So you can see the increased need of regulation in California. This is NREL's study that was done for the Eastern Interconnect. They said, hey, what's going to happen to these various balancing areas, MISO, ISO New England, New York ISO, PJM, Southwest Power Pool, Tennessee Valley, as you implement different types of renewable generation, as you add more. In this case, it was wind in particular. And so they looked at, what's the load? Okay, load only, and I happen to know PJM is about 1,000 megawatts or 100,000 megawatts of load, and it's about 1,000 megawatts of regulation needed, 1%. MISO similar. Once again, this is the base case, the blue on the far left. And then as you start adding the various scenarios, which is, hey, what if we put a lot of power offshore? What if we put a lot of power right on the mid-Atlantic area? What if we put a lot of power in the Midwest? How does this affect the need for regulation in these various balancing authorities, regional transmission authorities? And in every case, you can see it increasing relatively, relatively drastically, heck, very drastically. Scenario 4, sort of the kitchen sink approach. Let's just say we got to put a lot of renewables in everywhere. And then what are we going to need for more regulation? So you can see the regulation need is going to grow drastically. So why fast? Why batteries? Why are people doing both batteries and flywheels right now? A couple of studies that were done. This one was done by Pacific Northwest National Lab. And looking at the AGC signal, and as I talked about, the relatively slow generator output to match that signal. And once again, this signal is being generated by the imbalance of power flow going from one balancing authority to another. And so as you look at the actual generator output, you can see how in order to match this, they're going to have to then schedule for capacity more than just this amount. I mean, you can just say, look, in order to get up to the top of this, I'm going to need, maybe 5 times more generation. As compared to advanced energy storage, which is using the latest in inverter technology, which is using either flywheels or lithium ion or lead acid batteries for doing this type of work. It all depends on the state of charge at that point, the depth of discharge, and your life cycle assessment. In particular, what we're seeing is flywheels and lithium ion batteries being put out for this work right now. Is what seems to be fitting the right cost scale and the right physical footprint. Otherwise, lead acid gets extremely large. I looked at doing this with lead acid, and it was roughly a 50 by 100 foot building in order to put it together. So this one, well, this is done with a 20 megawatt, and this is going to fit within about an acre of land, actually, is what this would take for 20 megawatts as opposed to a 1 megawatt system. So Pacific Northwest, not only did they look at that, then they did the table, and they said, well, what would be an ideal resource? This would be unlimited power, unlimited energy, fast response, and then how does it compare to other types of technology? In California, we're pretty blessed with a lot of hydro capabilities, and we utilize that, and also a lot of pumped hydro, which is used for regulation, both frequency regulation and also spinning reserve. And that actually helps keep our prices pretty low. Our frequency regulation prices in California are somewhere down in the $10 to $20 per megawatt range, relatively low because of the hydro, which is very good. And that is the lowest for any of the others. New York ISO is up around $50 a megawatt, which is why there's two 20 megawatt battery projects and a third one being proposed for going into the New York ISO area. PJM's around $30 right now, and there are multiple 20 megawatt projects being promoted within that balancing authority. And then you can look at the steam turbines and combined cycle, just not that responsive to being able to provide the regulation effectiveness. So what they come up with is, hey, we can reduce the amount of regulation needs by up to 40% in the California ISO. That becomes really important because for several reasons. In particular, it's going to be important for making the batteries cost effective for doing this work. Experts agree. So we talked about the 20%. We saw roughly 600 megawatts, of regulation. When you get to 33%, the penetration level is higher. And when you think 33% RPS, I think everybody here, I want to make sure that's energy content. That's not capacity. That's not power that's being put on, but 33% of the energy. So sometimes the penetration of that renewable is going to be something much, much higher. And the variability of that means you're going to have the regulation and the spinning reserves in order to make that controllable. So you're looking at California Energy Commission saying we're going to need 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts of regulation during the ramping periods. Prevention of greenhouse gases, that's going to be another point. And on an incremental basis, because you can put these in a modular method, much more effective than combustion turbines. And this part on greenhouse gases is really important because as you are ramping combustion turbines, you are decreasing their heat rate, which means that they're going to put out more CO2 for the same amount of fuel, for the same amount of power output because of the ramping. And also their emission controls will not be nearly as effective because the SCRs will not be at the proper temperature for operation. So you're seeing a drastic increase in expected NOx saving. This came from Carnegie Mellon. Pretty good reports to cite. So that's good, I guess. I mean, it's good for technology that wants to come in and make an impact. And there's been a lot of work and a lot of tractors. As I mentioned, the multiple projects by Beacon, by AES, by Altair Nano, A123 for doing these projects. But it's been some demo work, and it's been a lot of work. Thank you. And it's been a lot of regulatory work. We talked about the barriers and what is it going to take to move us from now, the demo projects, or the initial commercial, and then what are the barriers you're seeing as you're walking in there. We have a technical approach. It seems to be cost effective, but initially, I mean, this service was provided only by generation. That's how the grid started. Just have some extra power there. We'll just let the generators run up and down. And as we've come into this deregulation, created these services, the very first tariffs were written, you had to be a generator in order to provide ancillary services. Well, that was silly. So FERC created, by FERC 890 ruling, said non-generation resources become available. That was good, but there were still technical barriers to size and to energy content. And those have been moved away. And now we can actually get batteries to be installed on the grid, limited energy storage resources, which are the most cost effective at this point. And so we've tailored the requirements for size and the requirements for energy to fit both the flywheels and the lithium-ion batteries. The next two steps are pretty important, and we're working on these now. And FERC has opened up the ability to provide this. Now you have to work at the various balancing authorities. PJM's leading, California ISO is right behind them. And it's all about pay for performance. I mentioned if you can do with regulation with 1 megawatt of battery what 2 megawatts or 3 megawatts of gas turbines can do, you should get paid for that. And that would help do two things. I'd say one thing in particular. It's going to be bring in investors. Because typically, as I mentioned, the frequency regulation has been provided by generation. That capital has been paid for through energy sales. Those energy sales are typically through 20-year or 30-year contracts with either the utilities or with another load-serving entity that pays for that capital, and then marginally they provide frequency regulation in that market. So there needs to be pay for performance, get a higher rate of return for the energy storage, and then also attract investors because now you'll have a much faster payback, which will bring that outside capital. The other piece, too, is a long-term market. Right now, frequency regulation is a day-ahead market. And I'm out of time, but there's a couple of good pictures there, so they'll be online. So.